They called him Silent Hawk, the giant Comanche who could snap a man's neck with his bare hands and disappear into the desert like smoke. But 6-year-old Stella Brooks would curl up against his chest and fall asleep to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. And that's when the people of Iron Ridge realized everything they thought they knew about monsters and angels was about to change forever. The town of Iron Ridge sat like a scab on the vast Texas landscape, a collection of weathered buildings and broken dreams that clung to existence through sheer stubbornness and the promise of silver in the nearby hills. It was September of 1887, and the frontier was still wild enough that a woman traveling alone with a child was either very brave or very desperate. Eleanor Brooks was both. She had walked into Iron Ridge on a Tuesday morning when the sun was already cruel, and the dust devils danced between the buildings like restless spirits. Her dress, once blue calico, had faded to the color of old bruises, and her boots were held together with determination and leather scraps. 6-year-old Stella stumbled beside her, clutching a corn-husk doll that had seen better days, her small face streaked with dirt and exhaustion. Eleanor's wedding ring had been sold 3 towns back for food, but she still twisted her finger where it used to be, a habit that betrayed how recently her world had collapsed. The wagon train had left them behind near Abilene when the cholera struck. Eleanor's husband James had been the first to fall, then half the company, and when the survivors moved on, they'd been too afraid of contagion to take a widow and child who might be carrying death in their blood. Eleanor had buried James with her own hands in ground, so hard she'd broken 2 fingernails clawing at the earth. And then she'd taken Stella's hand and started walking west, because east led back to nothing but memories and debt. Iron Ridges. Main Street stretched like a challenge between 2 rows of sun-bleached buildings. The saloon's batwing doors hung crooked on their hinges, and somewhere a dog barked with the persistence of madness. Eleanor approached the general store first, its windows clouded with years of dust and neglect. The proprietor, a thin man with suspicious eyes named Jeremiah Pike, looked her up and down like she was merchandise he wasn't sure he wanted to buy. "We don't extend credit to strangers," Pike said before Eleanor could even speak. His voice carried the particular meanness of a man who'd been disappointed too many times and decided to return the favor to the world. "I'm not asking for credit," Eleanor replied, her voice steady despite the hunger gnawing at her stomach. "I can work. Cooking, cleaning, mending. I just need a place for my daughter and me to stay while I earn enough for supplies." Pike's laugh was dry as old bones. "Lady, half the men in this town can't find steady work. What makes you think there's anything for a woman with a young'un Yilna?" Stella tugged at Eleanor's skirt and whispered, "Mama, I'm thirsty." The sound of her daughter's voice, small and trusting despite everything they'd endured, made Eleanor's chest tight. She'd walked 47 miles in the past 5 days, sleeping in abandoned shacks and under stars, always moving because staying still meant thinking about James, and thinking about James meant crying. And she couldn't afford tears when Stella needed her to be strong. "Please," Eleanor said, and the word cost her something precious. "My daughter needs water, food. Just tell me who might have work." Pike shrugged and turned back to his ledger. "Try the widow Carmichael. She runs the boarding house. But she don't take children, and she don't take charity cases." Eleanor left the store with Stella's hand in hers, and the weight of futility settling on her shoulders like dust. The boarding house was a 2-story structure that might have been white once, but had surrendered to the persistent gray of frontier life. Mrs. Carmichael was a woman built like a fence post, all sharp angles and bitter efficiency. She took one look at Eleanor and Stella and shook her head before they could even climb the porch steps. "No children," Mrs. Carmichael said through the screen door. "Too much noise, too much trouble. Try the church." But the church was a 1-room building with broken windows and a door that hung open to reveal emptiness inside. The preacher, if there had ever been one, was long gone, leaving only a wooden cross that leaned against the far wall like it was tired of standing upright. Eleanor sat on the church steps with Stella in her lap and tried to think of what James would have done. He'd been good at solving problems, good at making plans, good at believing things would work out if you just kept trying. But James was sleeping under Texas soil, and Eleanor was running out of both options and hope. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky the color of fresh blood, Eleanor heard the whispers. They started at the far end of the street and moved like wildfire from building to building, person to person. "He's coming back," someone said. "Silent Hawk's returning," said another. And then the street began to empty as people hurried inside and shuttered their windows. Eleanor didn't understand the sudden exodus until she saw him. He appeared at the edge of town like a figure from nightmare, mounted on a paint horse that moved with the fluid grace of running water. The man was enormous, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. His skin was the color of burnished copper, and his black hair hung in 2 thick braids that reached past his shoulders. He wore buckskin leggings and a blue cavalry shirt that had probably been taken from a dead soldier, and across his back was slung a rifle that looked like it could drop a buffalo at 300 yards. But it was his face that made Eleanor's breath catch. It was a face carved from stone and shadow, with high cheekbones and dark eyes that seemed to see everything and judge it all wanting. 3 parallel scars ran from his left temple to his jaw, old wounds that had healed white against his dark skin. This was clearly a man who had looked death in the face more than once and walked away. Silent Hawk rode down the main street at a pace that suggested he owned it, his horse's hooves raising small clouds of dust with each step. He didn't look left or right, didn't acknowledge the faces peering fearfully through windows, didn't seem to care that his presence had turned a living town into a ghost settlement. But when he reached the church where Eleanor sat with Stella, he stopped. The silence stretched between them like a held breath. Eleanor knew she should be afraid. Everything about this man screamed danger, from the weapons he carried to the way he sat his horse like he was born to it. The townspeople's fear was infectious, and she could feel it trying to crawl into her chest and make her run. But she was too tired to run, too hungry to move, and too desperate to care if this dark angel was friend or foe. Stella looked up at the mounted figure with the fearless curiosity that only children possess. "Mama," she said in a voice loud enough to carry. "Why is everyone hiding from the pretty horse?" Silent Hawk's dark eyes shifted from Eleanor to the child in her arms. For a moment, something flickered across his face. Not softness exactly, but a crack in the stone mask he wore. Stella waved at him with her small hand, and Eleanor felt her heart stop because she didn't know if this gesture of innocent friendship would be met with kindness or violence. The giant Comanche studied them for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Then without a word, he dismounted. His movements were fluid and silent, like a predator who had learned that noise meant death. He was even more imposing on foot, towering over Eleanor and blocking out the fading sunlight. Eleanor instinctively pulled Stella closer, but she didn't run. Where could she run to? And what would be the point? Silent Hawk reached into a leather pouch at his belt and withdrew something small. Eleanor tensed, expecting a knife or worse. Instead, he held out a piece of dried meat, pemmican mixed with berries and fat. He offered it to Stella with the same solemnity a king might show when offering a treaty. Stella looked up at her mother, who nodded slowly. The child took the food with both hands and bit into it eagerly. Her eyes widened with delight at the sweet and savory taste, and she smiled up at the tall stranger. "Thank you," she said with perfect politeness, the way Eleanor had taught her. Silent Hawk's expression didn't change, but he reached into his pouch again and withdrew another piece of pemmican, this one larger. He held it out to Eleanor. She hesitated, pride warring with hunger, but the sound of Stella chewing decided the matter. Eleanor took the food and whispered, "Thank you." The Comanche warrior nodded once, then returned to his horse. But instead of mounting and riding away, He began to unsaddle the animal with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this task thousands of times. Eleanor watched in confusion as he spread a blanket on the ground near the church and began setting up what was clearly a camp. "Mister," Eleanor said, finding her voice. "You don't need to." Silent Hawk held up one hand, and the gesture was so commanding that Eleanor fell silent immediately. He continued his preparations, building a small fire with dry wood that he seemed to produce from nowhere. As the flames took hold and began to push back the gathering darkness, Eleanor realized what he was doing. He was standing guard. Not over the town, but over her and Stella. The night brought its own sounds. Coyotes called from the hills, and somewhere an owl questioned the darkness. But inside the circle of firelight, there was an unexpected peace. Silent Hawk sat with his back against the church wall, his rifle across his knees, his dark eyes scanning the shadows. Eleanor had spread her thin shawl on the ground and lay with Stella curled against her side. The child had fallen asleep almost immediately, exhausted by their long journey and comforted by the warmth of the fire. "Why?" Eleanor began, then stopped. She wasn't sure how to finish the question. Why was he helping them? Why wasn't he the monster the townspeople believed him to be? Why did his presence, which should have terrified her, instead make her feel safer than she had since James died? Silent Hawk looked at her across the fire, and in his dark eyes, she saw something unexpected, understanding, not pity, which would have been insulting, but recognition. As if he knew what it meant to be alone in a hostile world, to have people fear you without knowing you, to carry burdens that bent your back and scarred your soul. "You have lost much," he said, and his voice was lower and gentler than she had expected. He spoke English with careful precision, each word chosen deliberately. The child should not pay for the world's cruelty. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, the first she had allowed herself since burying James. "We have nothing," she said. "No money, no family, nowhere to go. I can work, but no one will hire." A woman with a child. Silent Hawk was quiet for so long that Eleanor thought he might not answer. The fire crackled between them, sending sparks up toward the star-filled sky. Finally, he spoke again. "There is a place. 3 days' ride north. A ranch that needs workers. The owner does not ask questions about the past." "Why are you telling me this?" Eleanor asked. "Because," Silent Hawk said, his gaze shifting to sleeping Stella, "some journeys should not be made alone." As the fire burned lower and the night deepened, Eleanor found herself studying the man who had appeared like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known how to voice. The scars on his face told stories of violence survived, but his hands were gentle when he added wood to the fire. He moved with the economy of someone who wasted nothing, not motion, not words, not kindness. And when Stella stirred in her sleep and made a small sound of distress, Silent Hawk began to hum. It was barely audible, more felt than heard, but it was a lullaby that seemed to come from someplace deeper than memory. Eleanor closed her eyes and listened to that ancient song, and for the first time since James died, she allowed herself to believe that tomorrow might be different than today. That somewhere beyond the horizon, there might be a place where a widow and her daughter could build a new life, protected by a man the world called a monster, but who had shown them more kindness in one evening than Iron Ridge had offered in an entire day. As sleep finally claimed her, Eleanor's last conscious thought was of the gentle giant keeping watch over them, and she wondered what other truths the frontier might reveal to those brave enough to look beyond the surface. Dawn came slowly to Iron Ridge, painting the desert in shades of rose and gold that made the harsh landscape seem almost beautiful. Eleanor woke to the sound of Silent Hawk moving quietly around their makeshift camp, his massive frame silhouetted against the morning sky as he prepared his horse for travel. Stella was still asleep, her small body warm against Eleanor's side. One tiny fist clutched around her corn-husk doll. Silent Hawk had somehow procured supplies during the night. A canvas water bag hung from his saddle horn, and a cloth bundle that smelled of bread and dried fruit sat near the dying embers of their fire. Eleanor sat up slowly, trying not to wake Stella, and watched as the Comanche warrior checked his rifle and secured his gear with the methodical precision of someone who had learned that carelessness could mean death. "How did you get food?" Eleanor asked quietly. Silent Hawk glanced toward the general store, where Jeremiah Pike was just opening his shutters. "Some debts are older than others," he said, his voice carrying a weight that suggested stories Eleanor might never hear. "Pike's father once owed mine a life. Today seemed like a good day to collect." Eleanor understood that she was witnessing something significant. In a world where white settlers and Native Americans existed in a state of perpetual mistrust, Silent Hawk had called in a decades-old obligation to help a stranger. The magnitude of this gesture was not lost on her, and she felt a debt forming in her own heart that she wasn't sure she could ever repay. Stella stirred and opened her eyes, blinking in the morning light like a confused owl. When she saw Silent Hawk, her face broke into a smile that was pure sunshine. "Good morning, mister," she said with the easy politeness of a child who had been well raised. "Are we going on an adventure today?" Silent Hawk's stern expression softened almost imperceptibly. "We are traveling to a place where you and your mother might find work," he said. "It will be a long ride." "Are you brave enough for such a journey?" Stella sat up straighter, her chin lifting with 6-year-old determination. "I'm very brave," she announced. "Mama says I'm the bravest girl in Texas." "Then we should begin," Silent Hawk said. And Eleanor could swear she detected the ghost of a smile around his eyes. The horse Silent Hawk provided for Eleanor and Stella was a gentle mare named Windwalker, her coat the color of winter storms. Eleanor had ridden as a child on her father's farm, but it had been years since she'd been in a saddle. Silent Hawk helped them mount with a care that belied his fearsome reputation, his large hands steady and sure as he lifted Stella up in front of her mother. "She will carry you safely," he said, adjusting the stirrups to accommodate Eleanor's shorter legs. "Windwalker has traveled this path many times. Trust her instincts." As they rode out of Iron Ridge, Eleanor noticed that not a single person came out to watch them leave. Windows remained shuttered, doors stayed closed, and the town maintained its facade of abandonment until they were well beyond its borders. Only then did Eleanor see faces appearing cautiously at windows. Watching the dust cloud their horses kicked up as they headed north into country that looked increasingly wild and unforgiving. The landscape they traveled through was a study in harsh beauty. Red mesas rose from the desert floor like the spines of sleeping giants, and arroyos cut deep gashes across the terrain where flash floods had carved temporary rivers through stone and sand. Cacti stood sentinel in impossible gardens of thorns and defiance, their blooms adding splashes of yellow and pink to the austere palette of survival. Silent Hawk rode slightly ahead, his paint horse moving with the sure-footed grace of an animal that knew this country in its bones. He seemed to be constantly scanning the horizon, reading signs in the landscape that were invisible to Eleanor's untrained eyes. Occasionally he would hold up his hand to signal a stop, dismount, and examine tracks in the sand or study the flight patterns of distant birds. "Is there danger?" Eleanor asked during one of these pauses. "There is always danger," Silent Hawk replied, remounting his horse. "But the desert speaks to those who know how to listen. Today it tells me we are alone except for a family of javelinas 2 miles east and a hawk that hunts mice near that outcropping. The Apache passed through here 3 days ago, heading south. We will not encounter them." Stella was fascinated by these revelations. "How do you know all that?" she asked, her eyes wide with wonder. Silent Hawk pointed to barely visible marks in the sand. "The javelinas left tracks where they crossed the wash this morning. See how the sand has not yet been disturbed by wind. The hawk circles the same area repeatedly, which means prey is plentiful there. And the Apache horses were shod with iron, which leaves different marks than unshod ponies." The desert remembers everything, even if only for a short time. As they traveled, Eleanor found herself studying their guide with growing curiosity. Silent Hawk moved through the landscape like he was part of it, reading the subtle signs that meant the difference between life and death in this unforgiving country. His knowledge was encyclopedic and instinctive. He knew which plants held water, which animals indicated the presence of springs, and which cloud formations promised rain or sandstorms, but it was his interaction with Stella that truly revealed his character. When the child grew tired of writing, he began telling her stories. Not the sanitized fairy tales Eleanor remembered from her own childhood, but rich narratives about Coyote the Trickster, about the first horses, about brave warriors, and wise grandmothers who could speak to the spirits of the wind. His voice, when telling these tales, took on a musical quality that seemed to hypnotize both Stella and the horses. Long ago, he said as they rested in the shade of a massive boulder during the heat of midday, there was a young girl who could speak to animals. She lived with her grandmother in a place where the desert met the mountains, and every creature for miles around would come to her when they were hurt or lost. One day, a great storm came, and the animals asked the girl to lead them to safety. Stella listened with rapt attention, her small hands clutched around a cup of water that Silent Hawk had somehow coaxed from a seemingly dry well. "Did she save them?" Stella asked breathlessly. "She led them to a canyon where the walls were so high that the wind could not reach them," Silent Hawk continued. "But to get there, she had to walk through a valley where the spirits of angry warriors tried to frighten her. The animals could not follow because they were too afraid. So the girl had to choose: save herself or risk everything to lead them to safety." "What did she do?" Stella demanded. Silent Hawk's dark eyes met Eleanor's over the child's head. She remembered that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to do what is right despite the fear. So she walked into the valley of angry spirits, and because her heart was pure, they could not harm her. She led all the animals to safety, and when the storm passed, they built her a lodge in the canyon where she lived. As their protector for many years, Eleanor understood that this was more than just a story. It was a lesson wrapped in narrative about the choices that defined character. And she suspected that Silent Hawk had faced his own valley of angry spirits more than once. As the afternoon wore on, the terrain began to change. The flat desert gave way to rolling hills covered with scrub oak and pine. Streams appeared, their waters clear and cold, and the air carried the scent of grass and wildflowers instead of dust and sage. This was cattle country, Eleanor realized, land that could support the kind of ranching operation that might actually need workers. "How much farther?" Eleanor asked as they crested a hill that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. "We will reach Broken Arrow Ranch before sunset," Silent Hawk replied. "But first, you should know about the man who owns it." Eleanor felt a chill of apprehension. "What about him?" Silent Hawk was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Colonel Marcus Webb served in the war between the states. He came west afterward, like many broken men, seeking something the cities could not provide. He has seen enough violence to recognize it in others, and enough sorrow to understand mercy. He will judge you by your willingness to work, not by your past or your circumstances." "And he employs Indians?" Eleanor asked, suddenly understanding why Silent Hawk might know about this place. "He employs anyone who proves their worth," Silent Hawk said. "Mexican vaqueros freed slaves, former soldiers from both armies, and yes, sometimes Indians who choose to live between two worlds. Webb believes that good horses and honest work matter more than the color of a man's skin or the god he prays." 2. As they descended into the valley, Eleanor could see the ranch spread out below them like a small town. The main house was a sprawling adobe structure with a red tile roof and a wide veranda that wrapped around 3 sides. Outbuildings dotted the property. Bunkhouses, barns, corrals, and workshops that spoke of a serious operation. Cattle grazed in fenced pastures, and horses moved like flowing water through paddocks near the barn. But it was the people that caught Eleanor's attention. Even from a distance, she could see that Silent Hawk had spoken the truth. Men and women of various skin colors worked side by side, their movements coordinated by shared purpose rather than divided by prejudice. Children played in the dusty area between buildings, their laughter carrying up the hillside like music. "It looks like paradise," Eleanor murmured. "No place is paradise," Silent Hawk replied. "But some places offer the chance to build something better than what came before. Whether you succeed depends on your willingness to work for it." As they approached the ranch's main gate, a tall man emerged from the house. Colonel Webb was perhaps 50 years old, with silver hair and a mustache that spoke of military precision. He wore simple rancher's clothes, but he carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. A Colt revolver hung at his hip, worn with the easy familiarity of a tool rather than displayed as a threat. "Silent Hawk," Webb called out, his voice carrying genuine warmth. "I was wondering when you'd return. And I see you've brought guests." Silent Hawk dismounted and helped Eleanor and Stella down from Windwalker. "This is Eleanor Brooks and her daughter Stella," he said. "They have traveled far and need work. I thought you might have use for someone with her skills." Webb studied Eleanor with shrewd but not unkind eyes. "What skills would those be?" Eleanor lifted her chin, drawing on reserves of confidence she'd thought were exhausted. "I can cook for large groups, sir. I can mend and alter clothing, manage household accounts, and teach children to read and write. I'm not afraid of hard work, and I learn quickly." Webb nodded approvingly. "We can always use help in the kitchen, especially with roundup season coming. But I should warn you, Mrs. Brooks, this is not an easy life. The work is hard, the hours are long, and the pay is modest. What we offer in return is steady employment, decent food, and a safe place for you and your daughter." Stella tugged at Eleanor's skirt and whispered loudly, "Mama, can we stay?" "I like it here." Webb's stern expression cracked into a smile. "Well, young lady, what do you think you might contribute to our operation?" Stella considered this seriously. "I'm very good at feeding chickens," she announced. "And I know all my letters and numbers. And Silent Hawk says I'm brave enough for any adventure." Webb glanced at Silent Hawk, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "High praise indeed," Webb said. "In that case, I think we might be able to find a place for both of you. Silent Hawk, will you be staying for supper?" The Comanche warrior shook his head. "I have business elsewhere. But I will return this way before the snow flies." Eleanor felt a pang of loss at the thought of their protector leaving. In less than 24 hours, this intimidating stranger had become the closest thing to family she and Stella had. "Thank you," she said, the words inadequate for everything he had done. "For everything." Silent Hawk placed a gentle hand on Stella's head. "Remember the story of the girl who spoke to animals," he said. "Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to do what's right despite the fear," Stella finished. Proudly, Silent Hawk smiled then, a real smile that transformed his entire face. "You will do well here, little warrior. And perhaps when I return, you will have new stories to tell me." As Silent Hawk mounted his paint horse and rode toward the setting sun, Eleanor felt the weight of a new beginning settling on her shoulders. Broken Arrow Ranch spread out before them like a promise, and for the first time since James died, she allowed herself to hope that she and Stella might truly find a home. The first week at Broken Arrow Ranch passed like a fever dream of exhaustion and discovery for Eleanor and Stella Brooks. Eleanor had forgotten what it felt like to have purpose beyond mere survival, and the ranch's bustling kitchen became her proving ground. She rose before dawn each day to prepare meals for 37 ranch hands, her hands moving with increasing confidence as she learned the rhythms of feeding an army of hungry workers who judged her worth by the taste of her biscuits and the strength of her coffee. Colonel Webb had assigned them quarters in a small adobe cottage that sat between the main house and the workers' bunkhouses. It had 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, and windows that looked out toward the mountains where Silent Hawk had disappeared. The cottage came furnished with simple but sturdy pieces, a luxury Eleanor hadn't experienced since leaving her marriage bed back in Kansas. For the first time in months, Stella had her own bed, and Eleanor didn't have to sleep with one eye open, listening for threats that might emerge from the darkness. Stella adapted to ranch life with the fluid resilience that only children possess. Within 3 days, she had appointed herself assistant to Maria Santos, the ranch's head cook, a formidable Mexican woman whose grandmother had fed vaqueros since before Texas was a state.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Maria spoke a mixture of Spanish and English that Stella absorbed like a sponge, and soon the little girl was chattering away in both languages as she helped shell beans and gather eggs from the henhouse. Mia, Maria would say, using the Spanish term of endearment that made Stella beam with pride. You have good hands for cooking. Strong hands like your mama. Eleanor watched these interactions with a mixture of gratitude and wonder. At Broken Arrow, Stella wasn't seen as a burden or an inconvenience. She was simply another member of the community, with her own responsibilities and contributions. The ranch children, ranging in age from toddlers to teenagers, had absorbed her into their pack without question. They taught her to ride the gentle mare named Buttercup, showed her how to identify different cattle brands, and included her in elaborate games that involved defending the ranch from imaginary outlaws. But it was the evening ritual that truly revealed the ranch's unique character. Every night after supper, the entire community would gather in the main courtyard. Someone would produce a guitar, another might bring out a harmonica, and the evening would dissolve into storytelling and music that blended Mexican ballads with Confederate marching songs and Comanche war chants. Eleanor learned that many of the ranch hands were former soldiers from both sides of the Civil War, men who had found in this remote valley a place where old grudges could be buried beneath shared labor. Thomas Whitmore, the ranch foreman, was a former Union cavalry officer who had lost his left arm at Gettysburg. He worked alongside Carlos Mendoza, who had ridden with Confederate irregulars in Missouri before drifting west in search of something that felt less like defeat. The 2 men had developed a friendship based on mutual respect and their shared understanding that surviving a war meant learning to live with ghosts. The Colonel has a gift for collecting broken things and making them useful again, Thomas told Eleanor one evening as they watched Stella learn rope tricks from a weathered cowboy named Benjamin Tree, who was half Cherokee and had been tracking outlaws for the territorial marshal before Webb offered him steady work. Doesn't matter what broke you, long as you're willing to mend. Eleanor understood that she and Stella were part of this collection of the wounded and displaced. But rather than feeling like charity cases, they were becoming integral parts of a machine that functioned because everyone contributed according to their abilities. Eleanor's cooking improved morale in measurable ways. The men worked harder when they knew a good meal awaited them, and her willingness to listen to their stories and tend their minor injuries had made her something approaching a mother figure. To men who had been too long without families, the work was indeed hard, as Colonel Webb had warned. Eleanor's days began at 4 in the morning and often didn't end until after 8 at night. Her hands, soft from years of gentle domestic work, developed calluses and burns from handling heavy pots and feeding the wood-burning stove that seemed to devour fuel like a hungry dragon. But there was satisfaction in the work that Eleanor had never experienced before. She was feeding people who needed feeding, providing comfort to men whose lives offered precious little of it. Colonel Webb himself remained something of an enigma. He was unfailingly polite to Eleanor, but she sensed depths beneath his courteous exterior that she couldn't fathom. He had built something remarkable at Broken Arrow, a community that transcended the racial and cultural divisions that tore at the rest of the frontier. But Eleanor noticed that he often stood apart from the evening gatherings, watching from the shadows of his veranda like a man who had appointed himself guardian, but never quite participant. It was Maria Santos who finally explained the Colonel's story during a quiet afternoon when they were preparing preserves for the winter months ahead. El Coronel lost his family during the war, Maria said, her hands working steadily at chopping peaches while she spoke. His wife and 2 little ones died of fever while he was fighting in Virginia. When he came west, he was like a dead man, walking. But gradually, he began to collect us strays, and taking care of us brought him back to life. Eleanor felt a chill of recognition. She knew something about being a dead person walking, about existing in the space between breathing and living. "Does he ever speak of them?" she asked. Maria shook her head. "Never, but sometimes when the children are playing in the courtyard, I see him watching from his window with such sadness. He built this place to honor their memory, I think. A place where families could be safe and children could grow strong." This revelation cast Colonel Webb's kindness toward Stella in a new light. Eleanor began to notice how his eyes would soften when he watched the little girl helping with chores or playing with the other children. Once, she caught him teaching Stella to read using a worn Bible that he handled with the reverence of a man touching something sacred. His patience was infinite, his encouragement gentle, and Eleanor realized that in caring for Stella, he was perhaps caring for the children he had lost. The ranch's daily routine was punctuated by moments of beauty that reminded Eleanor why people fought so hard to tame this wild country. Sunrises painted the mountains in shades of gold and purple that no artist could capture. The sound of cattle lowing in distant pastures mixed with the laughter of children and the songs of birds to create a symphony of contentment. Even the work had its own poetry when performed by people who understood their place in the larger rhythm of the land, but it was the sense of safety that truly transformed Eleanor's world. For the first time since James died, she could sleep through the night without starting at every sound. Stella could run freely through the ranch grounds, without Eleanor fearing that someone might harm her, or that they might have to flee suddenly with only the clothes on their backs. This security allowed both mother and daughter to begin healing from wounds that went deeper than physical exhaustion. Eleanor began to dream again, something she hadn't done since burying her husband. Not the nightmares that had plagued her for months, but gentle dreams of futures that might be possible. She dreamed of Stella growing up strong and educated, of herself finding purpose beyond mere survival. These dreams felt dangerous because hope had betrayed her before, but she found herself unable to stop them from taking root in her heart. The other women on the ranch, few though they were, had welcomed Eleanor with a sisterhood born of shared understanding. Besides Maria, there was Sarah Whitmore, Thomas's wife, who had followed her husband west after the war, and now ran the ranch's small school for the workers' children. Sarah was an educated woman from Philadelphia who had sacrificed comfort for love and never seemed to regret the choice. She and Eleanor spent evenings mending clothes and sharing stories of the lives they had left behind. "I was afraid I would disappear out here," Sarah confessed one night as they worked by lamplight, "that the vastness would swallow me whole. But instead, I found out who I really was beneath all the expectations and pretenses. The frontier strips away everything that isn't essential." Eleanor understood exactly what Sarah meant. The woman she had been in Kansas, defined by her relationship to James and her position in society, was gone. The woman emerging at Broken Arrow was harder, more capable, more certain of her own worth. She was learning skills she had never imagined needing and discovering strengths she hadn't known she possessed. 3 weeks into their stay, Eleanor faced her first real test. A group of cattle rustlers had been operating in the area, and Colonel Webb had decided to move a large herd to winter pasture earlier than usual to avoid losing stock. This meant feeding 40 additional men for 5 days while they conducted the drive. Eleanor would be responsible for preparing meals that could be transported to workers scattered across miles of rangeland. The challenge seemed impossible. Until Maria took Eleanor aside and began teaching her the secrets of trail cooking that had been passed down through generations of vaquero families. Together, they prepared massive quantities of beans and beef that could be kept warm in Dutch ovens buried in coals. They baked enough sourdough bread to feed an army and prepared dried fruit and jerky that would provide energy for men working. From dawn to dusk, Eleanor worked 18-hour days during the cattle drive, her hands raw from handling hot metal and her back aching from bending over cooking fires. But when the men returned each evening, exhausted and covered in dust, the gratitude in their eyes made every sacrifice worthwhile. She had proven that she could handle whatever the ranch demanded of her, and the respect she earned during those 5 days became the foundation of her permanent place in the community. Stella, meanwhile, had attached herself to Benjamin Tree, the half-Cherokee tracker who had become something like a grandfather figure to all the ranch children. Benjamin possessed a vast knowledge of the natural world that he shared freely with anyone willing to listen. He taught Stella to identify animal tracks, to predict weather by watching cloud formations, and to move through the wilderness with the silent grace that had made his people masters of this land for countless generations. Little Star, Benjamin called her, using the English translation of her name. You have the eyes of someone who sees beyond the surface. That is a gift that will serve you well in this world. Eleanor watched these lessons with fascination and occasional concern. Benjamin was teaching Stella skills that belonged to a world that was rapidly disappearing as civilization pressed westward. But she also recognized that this knowledge might be exactly what her daughter needed to thrive in a country that demanded adaptation and resilience. The evening came when Eleanor realized that Broken Arrow Ranch had become more than just a place of employment. She was sitting on the porch of their cottage, watching Stella play with the other children while the adults gathered around the evening fire. The sound of laughter mixed with the distant lowing of cattle and the eternal whisper of wind through grass. Colonel Webb emerged from his house and walked over to where she sat. Mrs. Brooks, he said, settling into the chair beside hers, I want you to know that you and Stella have become valued members of our community. I hope you'll consider making this your permanent home. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of gratitude rather than sorrow. Colonel, I can't tell you what this place has meant to us. For the first time since my husband died, I feel like we're not just surviving. We're living, Webb nodded, his gaze following Stella as she raced through the courtyard with a pack of children in pursuit. That child has brought joy to this place that we didn't know we were missing. And you've made us remember what it means to be cared for. I hope Silent Hawk knows what he was doing when he brought you to us. As if summoned by the mention of his name, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the firelight. Silent Hawk had returned, as he had promised, moving out of the darkness like a spirit made flesh. The children squealed with delight and rushed to greet him, Stella leading the charge with her arms outstretched. The giant Comanche scooped her up effortlessly and settled her on his shoulders, his stern face softening into something approaching tenderness. Eleanor felt her heart lift at the sight of their protector return safely. She had not realized how much she had been worrying about him until the relief flooded through her. Silent Hawk had given them more than transportation to safety. He had given them the chance to discover who they could become when fear no longer governed their choices. As the evening progressed and stories were shared around the fire, Eleanor found herself studying the faces of the people who had become her new family. Each person carried scars, visible and invisible, from the lives they had left behind. But together, they had created something that transcended their individual wounds. They had built a place where healing was possible, where different cultures could blend into something stronger than any of them alone. When Stella finally fell asleep in Silent Hawk's arms, the gentle giant carried her to the cottage and helped Eleanor tuck her into bed. She grows strong, he observed quietly. Like a wildflower that finds water in the desert. She does, Eleanor agreed. We both do. Thank you for bringing us here. Silent Hawk studied her in the lamplight, his dark eyes seeing perhaps more than she intended to reveal. You have found your place, he said. That is good. But your journey is not finished. Eleanor felt a chill at his words, but before she could ask what he meant, Silent Hawk had melted back into the darkness, leaving her to wonder what challenges still lay ahead for the family she was building at Broken Arrow Ranch. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, carried by a circuit rider who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else than delivering bad news to a ranch full of armed men. Eleanor was in the kitchen preparing the noon meal when Colonel Webb appeared in the doorway, his face grave and a piece of paper trembling slightly in his weathered hands. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed to dim as he stepped into the room, and Eleanor felt her stomach drop with the intuition that comes from having survived too many disasters. Mrs. Brooks, Webb said, his voice carefully controlled. I'm afraid we have a problem. This letter is from a judge in Abilene. It seems your late husband had debts that someone is now trying to collect from you. Eleanor's hands stilled on the bread dough she had been kneading, flour dusting her fingers like snow. She had known this moment might come, had lived with the fear of it like a weight in her chest, but somehow had hoped that distance and time might have buried the past along with James. What kind of debts? She asked, though she already suspected the answer. Webb's expression grew darker as he consulted the letter. According to this, James Brooks owed substantial sums to a man named Thaddeus Morrison, a businessman from Kansas who apparently funded several failed ventures. Morrison claims your husband signed promissory notes that make you liable for the debt now that he's deceased. The total amount is listed as $1,200. The number hit Eleanor like a physical blow. $1,200 was more money than most ranch hands saw in 3 years, an impossible sum that might as well have been $12,000. She sank into a chair, her legs suddenly unsteady, and tried to process what this meant for her and Stella's carefully rebuilt life. There's more, Webb continued, his voice gentle but determined. Morrison has enlisted the services of a debt collector named Ezra Blackwood, and according to this letter, Blackwood is already en route to Texas with the legal authority to recover his client's property. That apparently includes you and Stella. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. She had heard stories about debt collectors, men who operated in the gray areas between law and brutality, who treated human beings like livestock to be recovered and sold. But I never signed anything, she protested. I didn't even know about these debts. Kansas territorial law is different from Texas law, Webb explained, settling into the chair across from her. Under Kansas statute, a wife can be held responsible for her husband's business debts, especially if she's believed to have benefited from the borrowed money. And since you're considered a resident of Kansas, that's the jurisdiction that applies. Eleanor thought of James's failed investments, the schemes he had pursued with such optimism and secrecy. She had known their finances were tight, but he had always assured her that his ventures would eventually pay off. Now she understood that he had been borrowing against their future, mortgaging her security and Stella's childhood to fund dreams that had crumbled to dust. How long do we have? Eleanor asked. Surprised by the steadiness of her own voice, Webb consulted the letter again. According to this, Blackwood left Kansas 3 weeks ago. Assuming he's traveling with a wagon and legal documents, he could arrive here within the next few days. Maybe sooner if he's pushed hard. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sound of ranch hands going about their morning chores. Eleanor stared at her flour-dusted hands and tried to think of options that didn't exist. She had no money to pay the debt, no legal standing to contest it, and nowhere to run that would be beyond the reach of territorial law. There might be another way, Webb said carefully, and something in his tone made Eleanor look up sharply. The letter mentions that Morrison would be willing to settle the debt in exchange for indentured service. 7 years of contracted labor to pay off what James owed. Eleanor felt her world tilt sideways. Indentured servitude was slavery by Another name, a system that trapped the poor in cycles of debt that could last generations. And Stella, she asked, though she dreaded the answer, would be included in the contract, Webb confirmed. Considered part of the collateral until she reaches the age of majority. The sound that escaped Eleanor's throat was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. She had walked across half of Texas to escape poverty and desperation, had found safety and purpose at Broken Arrow Ranch, had begun to believe that she and Stella might actually build a life worth living. Now it seemed that the past had followed them like a patient predator, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. "I won't let that happen," Eleanor said, and the steel in her voice surprised even her. "I'll die before I let them take Stella into servitude." Webb leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Mrs. Brooks, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You and Stella are part of this ranch family now, and we protect our own. Ezra Blackwood may have legal authority in Kansas, but he's in Texas now, and Texas has its own ideas about justice." Before Eleanor could respond, the sound of approaching horses echoed across the courtyard. Through the kitchen window, she could see a cloud of dust rising from the road that led to the ranch, too much dust to be caused by a single rider. Her heart began to pound as she realized that their time had run out more quickly than anyone had anticipated. "Get Stella and take her to the root cellar behind the main house," Webb ordered, his military bearings suddenly evident. "Don't come out until either I or Thomas comes for you personally. And Mrs. Brooks, whatever happens, remember that you're not alone in this fight." Eleanor found Stella in the chicken coop, helping Benjamin Tree repair a section of fence that had been damaged by a coyote the night before. The little girl looked up with a bright smile that cut through Eleanor's heart like a knife. How could she explain to a 6-year-old that the safety they had found was about to be ripped away by debts? She didn't understand for a father she could barely remember. "Mama," Stella said, noticing Eleanor's pale face. "Are you sick?" "No." "Sweetheart," Eleanor managed, forcing her voice to remain calm. "But we need to play a special game right now. Remember how Benjamin taught you about hiding from dangerous animals? Well, we need to practice that skill." Benjamin Tree looked up from his work, his weathered face reading the situation with the instincts of a man who had survived by recognizing trouble before it arrived. "Little star," he said to Stella, "your mama is right. Sometimes the best warriors are the ones who know when to be invisible. Can you show me how quiet you can be?" The root cellar was a stone chamber built into the hillside behind the main house, designed to keep vegetables cool during the brutal Texas summers. It was dark and musty, filled with the earthy smells of stored potatoes and preserved fruits. Eleanor sat with Stella in the darkness, holding her daughter close while they listened to the sounds of confrontation echoing from the courtyard above. Through the thick stone walls, Eleanor could hear voices raised in argument, the colonel's measured tones contrasting with a harsh voice she didn't recognize. Occasionally, the sound of boots on hard-packed earth suggested movement, and once she heard what might have been the metallic click of a rifle being cocked. Stella pressed closer to her mother, sensing the tension even if she didn't understand. "Its source, Mama," Stella whispered. "Are the bad men here?" Eleanor stroked her daughter's hair and tried to project a calm she didn't feel. "Colonel Webb and the others are handling it, sweetheart. We just need to be patient and trust them to keep us safe." But Eleanor's confidence was shaken by the memory of Webb's expression when he had read the letter. Even the most well-intentioned people had limits to what they could accomplish when faced with the full weight of territorial law. If Ezra Blackwood had proper documentation and legal authority, there might be nothing the ranch could do to protect them. The argument above seemed to go on for hours, though Eleanor knew it was probably only minutes. Then came a sound that made her blood freeze, Stella's voice calling out clearly, "Colonel Webb, where are Mama and me supposed to hide?" Eleanor's heart stopped as she realized that Stella had somehow gotten out of the root cellar and was now exposed in the courtyard above. Before she could move, she heard heavy footsteps approaching the cellar entrance. and a voice that carried the cold authority of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Mrs. Eleanor Brooks," the voice called out. "My name is Ezra Blackwood, and I have legal documents that require you and your daughter to accompany me back to Kansas. You can come out voluntarily, or I can have my men extract you. The choice is yours." Eleanor closed her eyes and tried to think of options that didn't exist. She could stay hidden and hope that Blackwood would leave without Stella, but that seemed unlikely. She could try to run, but where could a woman and child go in this vast country that a determined man with horses and legal authority couldn't follow? Or she could face the situation directly and hope that somehow, some way, there might be a solution she couldn't see from the darkness of her hiding place. "I'm coming out," Eleanor called back, her voice steadier than she felt. "But I want to see these legal documents you're talking about." Eleanor emerged from the root cellar to find the ranch courtyard, transformed into a scene from her worst nightmares. Ezra Blackwood stood near the main house, a tall man dressed in a black suit that marked him as a city dweller despite the trail dust that covered his clothes. He was flanked by 4 armed men who looked like they had been recruited from the worst saloons and gambling halls of the frontier. Their eyes were cold and calculating, the eyes of men who viewed human suffering as a business opportunity. Colonel Webb and his men had positioned themselves strategically around the courtyard, their weapons visible but not openly threatening. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Eleanor realized that she was witnessing a standoff that could explode into violence at any moment. Stella stood near the main house, her small hand clutched in Sarah Whitmore's protective grip. The little girl's eyes were wide with confusion and fear, but she hadn't cried or called out for her mother. Eleanor felt a fierce pride in her daughter's courage, even as her heart broke at the terror that must be coursing through the child's mind. "Mrs. Brooks," Blackwood said, his voice carrying the smooth authority of a man who had practiced intimidation until it became an art form. "I represent the interests of Mr. Thaddeus Morrison of Topeka, Kansas. Your late husband, James Brooks, entered into several business agreements with my client that resulted in substantial debt. According to Kansas territorial law, you are now responsible for satisfying that debt." Blackwood produced a leather portfolio and withdrew several official-looking documents. Eleanor forced herself to examine them carefully, though the legal language was dense and confusing. The papers appeared legitimate, bearing official seals and signatures, and the debt amount was exactly as Webb had stated. $1,200, plus accumulated interest and collection fees. "I never signed these agreements," Eleanor said, her voice carrying across the courtyard. "I had no knowledge of my husband's business dealings. Kansas law doesn't require your signature." Blackwood replied with the patience of a man explaining simple facts to a child. A wife's consent to her husband's business debts is assumed unless specifically documented otherwise. Since there's no record of you filing an objection to these agreements, you're legally responsible for their satisfaction. Eleanor felt the trap closing around her like the jaws of some massive predator. The law had been written by men, for men, and it assumed that women were property to be disposed of according to their husband's wishes. She had no legal standing to contest the debt, no money to pay it, and no protection under a system that viewed her and Stella as collateral to be recovered. However, Blackwood continued, Mr. Morrison is a reasonable man. He's prepared to accept 7 years of indentured service from you and your daughter in lieu of cash payment. You'll be provided with food, shelter, and clothing during your term of service, and at the end of 7 years, the debt will be considered. Satisfied, Colonel Webb stepped forward, his hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. Mr. Blackwood, you're welcome to state your business on my property, but Mrs. Brooks and her daughter are under my protection. Any attempt to remove them against their will would be considered an act of aggression. Blackwood's cold smile never wavered. Colonel, I appreciate your loyalty to your employees, but this is a matter of territorial law, not personal preference. I have the legal authority to recover Mr. Morrison's property. And that authority supersedes any local arrangements you might have made. The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring, with armed men on both sides calculating odds and consequences. Eleanor realized that the situation was balanced on a knife's edge, and any wrong move could result in bloodshed that would solve nothing and might cost innocent lives. Then, like an answer to a prayer she hadn't known how to voice, a familiar figure emerged from the shadows near the barn. Silent Hawk moved with the fluid grace that had given him his name, appearing suddenly in the courtyard, as if he had materialized from the desert air itself. The Comanche warrior was armed with his customary rifle, but it was his presence more.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Than his weapons that changed the dynamic of the confrontation. Ezra Blackwood, Silent Hawk said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to command attention. You are a long way from Kansas. Blackwood's confident expression flickered for the first time since his arrival. Do I know you? You should, Silent Hawk replied, stepping closer with the predatory grace of a hunting cat. I am the man who tracked you through 3 territories 2 years ago, when you tried to collect a debt from the Cheyenne woman named White Dove. I am the man who convinced you that some debts are not worth collecting. Eleanor saw fear flicker across Blackwood's face before he managed to regain his composure. Clearly, he and Silent Hawk had a history that didn't favor the debt collector. That was different, Blackwood said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. This is a legal matter with proper documentation. This, Silent Hawk said, gesturing toward Eleanor and Stella, is a family under my protection. And I suggest you remember what happened the last time you ignored my advice about leaving. People in peace. The threat hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, and Eleanor realized that Silent Hawk's reputation extended far beyond the borders of Texas. Whatever had happened between these 2 men in the past had left Blackwood with a healthy respect for the Comanche warrior's capabilities. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, Eleanor found herself at the center of a confrontation that would determine not just her future, but the future of everyone she had come to love at Broken Arrow Ranch. The standoff stretched into the evening hours as neither side showed signs of backing down. Blackwood's men had positioned themselves strategically around the courtyard, their hands never far from their weapons, while the ranch hands maintained their own defensive positions with the practiced ease of men who had faced worse odds in darker places. The air crackled with tension that seemed to make even the horses restless in their corrals, and Eleanor found herself caught in the eye of a storm that could destroy everything she had worked to build. Silent Hawk had not moved from his position near the center of the courtyard, but his presence seemed to fill the space like smoke from a signal fire. His dark eyes moved constantly, cataloging threats and calculating distances with the instinctive awareness of a predator who had survived by being faster and more ruthless than anything that hunted him. Eleanor noticed that Blackwood's men gave the Comanche warrior a wide berth, their earlier confidence eroded by stories they had probably heard around campfires and in saloons across the territory. Mr. Blackwood, Colonel Webb said, breaking the silence that had settled over the ranch like a funeral shroud. I'm prepared to make you a business proposition. Mrs. Brooks owes $1,200 according to your documents. I'll pay that debt in full right now, in exchange for you tearing up those papers and riding out of here tonight. Eleanor felt her heart leap at the colonel's offer, but she also felt the crushing weight of a debt she could never repay. $1,200 was more money than she could earn in a lifetime of cooking for ranch hands, and the thought of being indebted to Webb instead of Morrison felt only marginally better than indentured servitude. The colonel was offering to sacrifice his own financial security for her freedom, a gesture that left her speechless with gratitude and shame. Blackwood considered the offer with the calculating expression of a man who measured everything in terms of profit and loss. His cold eyes swept across the assembled ranch hands, counting weapons and measuring resolve, before settling back on Webb with predatory patience. "That's generous, Colonel, but Mr. Morrison's instructions were very specific. He wants the woman and child delivered to Kansas for reasons that go beyond simple debt collection. I'm afraid money alone won't resolve this situation." Eleanor felt ice forming in her stomach as she realized that there was more to this than unpaid loans. The way Blackwood spoke about Morrison's instructions carried undertones of personal vendetta that made her skin crawl. "What other reasons?" she demanded, finding her voice despite the fear that threatened to choke her words. Blackwood's smile was thin and predatory, the expression of a man who enjoyed delivering bad news. "It seems your late husband had a business partner before he married you, a gentleman who believed he was entitled to a larger share of James's estate than what he received. Mr. Morrison has certain expectations about recovering his losses, and those expectations include ensuring that James Brooks's widow and child are properly supervised during their term of service." The ugly truth hit Eleanor like a physical blow, driving the air from her lungs and making her legs unsteady. This wasn't just about debt collection. Morrison had some personal vendetta against James, some grievance that he intended to settle by enslaving the family James had left behind. She was not just a debtor in Morrison's eyes, she was a trophy, a symbol of his victory over a dead man who could no longer fight back. The realization that her husband's business dealings would continue to haunt her even beyond the grave filled her with a rage so pure it burned away her fear. "You son of a bitch," Thomas Whitmore snarled, his hand moving toward his sidearm, with the practiced motion of a man who had killed before and would do so again without hesitation. "You're talking about slavery, pure and simple. I'm talking about legal debt collection under territorial law," Blackwood replied coolly, his voice carrying the smooth authority of a man who had used legal technicalities to justify unconscionable acts before. "What Mr. Morrison chooses to do with his property once it's been recovered is his business, not yours. The law is quite clear on the matter of inherited debts and the remedies available to creditors." Eleanor felt the bitter irony of her situation settling like lead in her stomach. She had fled Kansas to escape poverty and desperation, had walked across half of Texas seeking freedom and opportunity, only to discover that the law itself had followed her like a hunting dog. The same legal system that had failed to protect her from James's reckless borrowing was now being used to justify her enslavement by a man she had never met. Silent Hawk moved then, not toward Blackwood but toward Stella, who had been standing frozen with fear near the main house throughout the confrontation. The giant Comanche knelt beside the little girl with the fluid grace of a predator who could be gentle when gentleness served his purpose. He spoke to her in a voice so low that only she could hear his words, and Eleanor watched her daughter's face transform as Silent Hawk whispered whatever reassurance or instruction he was sharing. She saw Stella nod with the serious expression of a child who understood that important things were being decided about her future. "Little star," Silent Hawk said, loud enough for everyone to hear, his voice carrying the musical quality that always emerged when he spoke to children. "Do you remember the story I told you about the girl who could speak to animals?" Stella nodded solemnly, her small chin lifting with the courage that had sustained her through their long journey from Kansas. She had to choose between saving herself or saving everyone else. And what did she choose? "She chose to be brave," Stella said, her small voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, despite the tension that made even the grown men speak in whispers. "She walked into the valley of angry spirits because it was the right thing to do." Silent Hawk smiled then, an expression that transformed his harsh features into something almost gentle. The scars that marked his face seemed to soften in the lamplight, and Eleanor caught a glimpse of the man he might have been if the world had offered him different choices. "Very good. Now I need you to go with Mrs. Whitmore and wait in the house while the adults finish talking. Can you be brave enough to do that?" Stella looked at her mother, seeking permission with eyes that held too much understanding for someone so young. Eleanor nodded despite every instinct that screamed against letting her daughter out of sight, knowing that Silent Hawk was right to remove the most vulnerable person from a situation that was rapidly approaching violence. Sarah Whitmore appeared at Stella's side like a guardian angel and gently guided her toward the main house, leaving the adults to settle matters that had grown too dangerous for young eyes. With Stella safely removed from immediate danger, the dynamic in the courtyard shifted subtly but significantly. The ranch hands relaxed slightly, no longer worried about a child being caught in crossfire, while their hands moved closer to their weapons with the deadly purpose of men who had decided that some lines could not be crossed. Blackwood's men seemed to grow more tense without the leverage that Stella's presence had provided, and Eleanor realized that Silent Hawk had deliberately removed the most vulnerable piece from the board, while simultaneously freeing the ranch defenders to act without restraint. Mr. Blackwood, Silent Hawk said, rising to his full imposing height and moving closer with the predatory grace of a hunting cat. I believe it's time you heard the rest of the story about our previous encounter. Blackwood's face went pale beneath his trail dust, but he maintained his facade of confidence like a gambler who knew he was holding losing cards, but couldn't afford to fold. Ancient history has no bearing on current legal matters. On the contrary, Silent Hawk continued, closing the distance between them with steps that seemed casual but carried the promise of sudden violence. It has everything to do with the choice you're about to make. 2 years ago, you came hunting White Dove with papers that claimed she owed money to a man who had never lent her a cent. You had 4 men with you then. 2 hard cases who thought they could intimidate a lone Indian woman with threats and chains. Eleanor watched Blackwood's men exchange uneasy glances as Silent Hawk continued his story. Clearly, the debt collector's previous encounter with the Comanche warrior had not ended well for him, and the hired guns were beginning to understand that they might have signed on for more than they had bargained for. The body language of professional killers was easy to read once you knew the signs, and Eleanor could see doubt creeping into their eyes like smoke from a distant fire. You found White Dove's camp at dawn, surrounded her with your men, and demanded that she come with you too. Work off a debt that existed only in forged documents. You thought she was helpless because she was alone, because she was Indian, because she was a woman. You thought wrong. Silent Hawk's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but every word carried across the courtyard with crystal clarity. The Comanche warrior had learned the power of quiet speech, how men strained to hear whispered threats in ways they ignored shouted ones. I arrived just as you were putting chains on her wrists. Your men never heard me coming. The first one died with my knife between his ribs, for he knew I was there. The second managed to scream before I opened his throat. The third and fourth tried to run, but a man on foot cannot outrun a Comanche warrior who knows the land like his own heartbeat. That's enough, Blackwood said, his voice cracking with strain as sweat began to bead on his forehead, despite the cooling evening air. You're talking about murder. I'm talking about justice, Silent Hawk replied with the calm certainty of a man who had never doubted the righteousness of his actions. White Dove was under the protection of my people, and you violated that protection with lies and forged papers. I let you live because you promised to never again use false documents to enslave innocent people. You swore an oath on your mother's grave that you would find honest work and leave the vulnerable in peace. It seems you've forgotten that promise. Eleanor felt the pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place as she listened to Silent Hawk's revelation. He wasn't just a wandering Comanche warrior who happened to help people in distress. He was something more dangerous and more necessary, a guardian who operated outside the boundaries of territorial law to protect those who had no other protection. The realization that she and Stella had been placed under the care of someone who killed slavers and debt collectors for a living should have terrified her, but instead she felt a fierce gratitude that made her hands shake. Colonel Webb stepped forward, his military bearing evident in every line of his body as he addressed Blackwood with the authority of a man who had commanded troops in battle. "Mr. Blackwood, I think it's time you reconsidered your position. You're outnumbered, outgunned, and clearly out of your depth. I suggest you take your men and ride out of here while you still can." But Blackwood had invested too much in this expedition to back down easily. His reputation among the community of debt collectors and bounty hunters depended on completing difficult assignments, and failure here would mean the end of his career in a business that offered few second chances. "Colonel, you're interfering with illegal debt collection. That makes you an accessory to theft and potentially subject to territorial prosecution. Are you prepared to risk everything you've built here for the sake of one woman?" "I'm prepared to risk everything for the sake of what's right," Webb replied without hesitation, his voice carrying the conviction of a man who had already lost everything once and discovered that some things mattered more than personal security. "And if that means facing down territorial authorities, so be it. I've faced worse odds for worse causes, and I'm still standing." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes at the depth of loyalty these people were showing her. She had arrived at Broken Arrow Ranch as a desperate stranger with nothing to offer but willingness to work, and now an entire community was prepared to stand against legal authority to protect her and Stella. The magnitude of their sacrifice was almost too much to bear, and she found herself wondering what she had done to deserve such fierce protection from people who owed her nothing. "There is another way," Silent Hawk said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Through silk. Mr. Blackwood, you and I could settle this matter according to older laws than those written by territorial judges. Single combat, weapons of your choice, with the winner determining Mrs. Brooks's fate. If you win, she goes with you freely. If I win, you burn those papers and never trouble her again." Blackwood laughed, but there was no humor in the sound, only the brittle edge of a man whose nerves were beginning to fray under pressure. "I'm not going to duel an Indian savage over a business matter. This is the 19th century, not the Dark Ages." "Then you're a coward as well as a liar," Silent Hawk replied mildly, the insult delivered with such casual authority that it hit like a physical blow. "But perhaps one of your men has more courage than their employer. Any one of you willing to face me in honest combat for the right to claim this woman and child?" The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire, and Eleanor watched, Blackwood's face flushed with anger as the insult hit its mark. She also noticed that his men were studying their employer with new interest, clearly wondering if they had signed on with someone who would abandon them at the first sign of real danger. The psychology of hired guns was brutally simple. They followed strength and abandoned weakness, and Blackwood's refusal to accept Silent Hawk's challenge marked him as weak in their eyes. "I don't need to prove my courage to anyone," Blackwood snarled, his carefully maintained composure finally beginning to crack under the pressure of Silent Hawk's psychological warfare. "I have legal authority, and that's all the weapon I need. Legal authority means nothing if you're not alive to exercise it," Silent Hawk observed with the casual tone of a man discussing the weather. "And I notice your men are starting to look nervous. How much are you paying them, Mr. Blackwood? More than their lives are worth. Because I can promise you that at least 2 of them won't be riding out of here alive if this situation continues much longer." Eleanor watched the psychological warfare with fascination and growing hope as Silent Hawk systematically dismantled Blackwood's position by attacking his credibility with his own men. The debt collector's hired guns were clearly re-evaluating their commitment to a mission that was looking increasingly dangerous and decreasingly profitable. Professional killers might be willing to risk their lives for the right price, but they were also practical men who understood that dead mercenaries couldn't spend their wages. The first crack in Blackwood's facade appeared when one of his men, a grizzled gunfighter with scars that told stories of previous mistakes and narrow escapes, stepped back from his position near the main house and shook his head, with the disgusted expression of a man who had finally seen enough. "Ezra," I signed on to collect a debt from some helpless widow. Not to start a war with half of Texas. You want to tangle with that Comanche devil and his friends. You find yourself another fool. The gunfighter mounted his horse with deliberate slowness, making it clear that he was withdrawing from the confrontation, rather than fleeing in panic. He rode out of the courtyard without looking back, leaving Blackwood with 3 men, instead of 4, and a visible crack in the facade of unified purpose he had been trying to maintain. Eleanor could see panic beginning to creep into the debt collector's eyes as his carefully planned expedition started to unravel like a rope under too much strain. Anyone else want to reconsider their career choices? Silent Hawk asked conversationally, his dark gaze moving from one hired gun to the next with the patient assessment of a predator selecting his next victim. Because I can promise you that this situation is going to get much worse before it gets better. Mrs. Brooks is under my protection now, and I have a reputation for being very thorough when it comes to protecting what's mine. A second man wavered, looking between Blackwood's increasingly desperate expression and the armed ranch hands who surrounded them with the quiet competence of men who had faced down raiders and rustlers before. The smart play was obvious to anyone with half a brain, and Eleanor held her breath as she waited to see if greed or survival instinct would win the internal battle being fought behind the gunman's calculating eyes. "This is ridiculous," Blackwood declared, his voice rising with desperation as he watched his carefully assembled team disintegrate before his eyes. "I have legal documents. I have territorial authority. You can't just ignore the law because you don't like what it says." "The law," Silent Hawk said, and his voice carried the weight of centuries of injustice suffered by his people at the hands of men who wielded legal documents like weapons, "is a tool used by powerful men to steal from the powerless. Sometimes the only real justice comes from those willing to stand outside the law and do what's right." Eleanor felt the truth of those words resonate in her bones like the echo of distant thunder. The law had failed to protect her from James's debts, had failed to recognize her rights as an individual, had treated her and Stella like property to be recovered rather than human beings deserving of dignity and freedom. If justice was going to come, it would have to come from people like Silent Hawk and Colonel Webb, who measured right and wrong by standards older and truer than territorial statutes. The confrontation reached its climax as the sun disappeared behind the mountains and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Blackwood stood in the center of the courtyard like a man caught in quicksand, his remaining men clearly wavering in their loyalty while the ranch community presented a united front against his claims of legal authority. Eleanor realized that she was witnessing something rare and precious, a moment when ordinary people chose to stand up to institutional power and say that some things mattered more than written law. "Mr. Blackwood," Colonel Webb said with military precision, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had commanded troops in battles where hesitation meant death, "you have exactly 10 minutes to collect your men and leave my property. After that, I'm going to consider you an armed trespasser and act accordingly." Eleanor held her breath as Blackwood made the calculation that would determine her future and Stella's. The debt collector's eyes darted between Silent Hawk's implacable presence and the determined faces of the ranch hands who surrounded him like a closing trap. Whatever mathematics of fear and profit he was working in his head, the answer seemed increasingly clear with each passing second. "This isn't over," Blackwood said finally, his voice carrying the promise of future trouble and the bitter taste of present defeat. "Morrison has resources you can't imagine, and territorial law is still territorial law. We'll be back with federal marshals and enough men to take what's owed, and when we do, there won't be enough of you left to bury. When you come back," Silent Hawk said quietly, his words carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "I'll be waiting." As Blackwood and his remaining men mounted their horses and disappeared into the gathering darkness like shadows fleeing the dawn, Eleanor felt a mixture of relief and dread settle in her chest like competing storms. They had won this battle through courage and solidarity, But the war was far from over, and she knew that the debt collector's threats were not empty posturing, but promises that would eventually be kept. 3 months after Blackwood's failed attempt to reclaim Eleanor and Stella, winter settled over Broken Arrow Ranch, like a protective blanket that muffled the outside world and gave the community time to heal from the confrontation that had tested everyone's resolve. The first snow had fallen in early December, transforming the harsh landscape into something beautiful and peaceful, and Eleanor found herself standing at the kitchen window watching Stella build snow animals with the other ranch children. Wow. Their laughter echoed across the white-covered courtyard. The threat of Morrison's return hung over the ranch like a sword suspended by spider silk. But life had a way of demanding attention to immediate needs regardless of future dangers. The cattle still needed to be fed, the horses still required care, and 37 people still expected 3 meals a day, prepared with the skill and love that had made Eleanor indispensable to the ranch's daily operations. She had discovered that work was the best medicine for anxiety, that keeping her hands busy helped quiet the voice in her head that whispered about federal marshals and legal documents that could destroy everything she had built. Colonel Webb had spent the week since Blackwood's departure making discreet inquiries through his network of former military contacts, trying to determine what resources Morrison might actually possess and how much influence territorial law would have if the debt collector returned with federal backing. The news was not encouraging. Morrison was indeed a wealthy and connected man with ties to territorial judges and federal appointments, and his claim against Eleanor appeared to be legally sound under the complex web of statutes that govern debt collection across territorial boundaries. The law is not on our side, Webb had told Eleanor during one of their evening conversations on the main house veranda. Morrison has money, political connections, and technical legal authority. If he comes back with federal marshals, we won't be able to simply face them down with superior numbers and righteous anger. Eleanor had nodded, understanding the implications without needing them spelled out. The ranch community could stand against hired guns and crook debt collectors, but defying federal authority would mean transforming everyone at Broken Arrow into outlaws, and Webb had too many people depending on him to make that choice lightly. But Silent Hawk had different ideas about the nature of justice and the obligations that transcended written law. He had remained at the ranch through the winter months, officially helping with security, but actually serving as a constant reminder that some debts could only be paid in blood. Eleanor had watched him training with the younger ranch hands, teaching them tracking skills and survival techniques that might prove useful if peaceful solutions proved impossible. He was preparing for war while hoping for peace, and his presence gave the entire community a sense of confidence that would have been impossible without him. The Comanche warrior had also taken a special interest in Stella's education, teaching her skills that no territorial school would have considered appropriate for a young lady. She could now identify animal tracks in snow, predict weather changes by watching cloud formations, and move through the wilderness with a silence that would have impressed warriors twice her age. More importantly, Silent Hawk had been teaching her about courage, about the difference between fearlessness and bravery, about the responsibility that came with being protected by others. Little star, he had told her during one of their afternoon lessons, you are growing strong in body and spirit, but strength without wisdom is dangerous. Remember that the greatest warriors are those who fight only when fighting is the only choice left. Stella had absorbed these lessons with the serious attention she gave to everything Silent Hawk taught her, and Eleanor marveled at how her daughter had grown in confidence and capability during their time at the ranch. The frightened child who had clung to her skirts in Iron Ridge had become a competent young person who could handle responsibilities and face challenges that would have overwhelmed many adults. Christmas had come and gone with a celebration that blended traditions from all the cultures represented at the ranch. Mexican posadas mixed with Confederate carols and Comanche winter ceremonies to create something unique and beautiful, a fusion of human traditions that reflected the community's commitment to to finding unity amid diversity. Eleanor had cooked for 3 days straight, preparing dishes that honored everyone's heritage while creating new traditions that belonged specifically to Broken Arrow Ranch. It was during the New Year celebration that the next chapter of their story began to unfold. A lone rider appeared at the ranch gates on January 2nd, carrying mail and news from the outside world that had been delayed by winter storms. Among the letters was one addressed to Colonel Webb in an official envelope that bore the seal of the Territorial Governor's Office. Eleanor felt her stomach drop as she watched Webb read the letter, his expression growing darker with each line. When he finished, he folded the paper carefully and looked around the room at the assembled ranch community with the expression of a man delivering news he wished he didn't have to share. Morrison has filed a formal complaint with the Territorial Government, Webb announced, his voice steady but grim. He's claiming that we're harboring fugitive debtors and interfering with legal debt collection. The Territorial Governor has ordered a federal investigation, and we can expect a visit from U.S. Marshals within the next few weeks. The silence that followed this announcement was heavy with the weight of decisions that would have to be made. Everyone in the room understood that federal marshals represented a level of authority that couldn't be intimidated or faced down with superior numbers. If the marshals arrived with proper warrants and federal backing, defying them would mean turning the entire ranch community into federal fugitives. What are options? Thomas Whitmore asked, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who had faced impossible choices before. Webb set the letter on the table and looked around the room at faces that had become family over the years of shared hardship and mutual support. We can surrender Mrs. Brooks and Stella to federal custody and hope that territorial courts will be more sympathetic than Morrison expects. We can help them disappear into Mexico or Canada where territorial law can't reach them. Or we can stand and fight, knowing that we'll all become federal fugitives if we do. Eleanor felt the weight of every eye in the room settling on her, and she understood that these people who had become her family were waiting for her to make a choice that would determine all their futures. The magnitude of the decision threatened to crush her, but she also felt a strength rising within her that had been forged in the fires of loss and hardship and community support. I won't ask any of you to become outlaws for my sake, Eleanor sighed, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to spill from her eyes. You've already given me and Stella more than we had any right to expect. If running away or surrender will keep you safe, then that's what we'll do. Silent Hawk stepped forward then, his imposing presence filling the room like smoke from a sacred fire. There is another way, he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that made even strong men listen when he spoke. A way that honors both law and justice, but requires courage from all of us. Eleanor felt her breath catch as Silent Hawk began to outline a plan that was both brilliant and terrifyingly dangerous. He had been thinking about this problem for months, considering angles and possibilities that hadn't occurred to anyone else, and his solution required a level of trust and coordination that would test the bonds that held the ranch community together. Morrison's legal claim depends on territorial law recognizing the validity of debts incurred in Kansas. Silent Hawk explained, his dark eyes moving around the room to gauge reactions. But territorial law also recognizes certain forms of protection that supersede debt collection. If Mrs. Brooks were to be adopted into the Comanche Nation under traditional law, she would be under tribal protection, and federal marshals would have no authority to remove her from tribal lands. Eleanor felt her world shift as she began to understand what Silent Hawk was proposing. Adoption into a Native American tribe would make her legally a different person under territorial law, someone whose obligations and protections were governed by treaties between sovereign nations rather than territorial statutes. It was a loophole that Morrison probably hadn't considered, but it would require her to abandon her identity as a white woman and accept a place in a culture she barely understood. But the ranch isn't tribal land, Thomas pointed out, working through the implications of Silent Hawk's proposal. No, Silent Hawk agreed, but there are Comanche reservation lands 3 days' ride north of here. If Mrs. Brooks and Stella were to be formally adopted into the tribe and relocated to reservation land, they would be beyond Morrison's reach, regardless of what federal marshals might want. Eleanor felt the pieces of the plan clicking into place, but she also understood the sacrifices it would require from everyone involved. She would have to leave the ranch that had become home, abandon the life she had built as Eleanor Brooks, and trust her future to people whose customs and language she didn't fully understand. It was a form of death and rebirth that required a level of courage she wasn't sure she possessed. "There's more," Silent Hawk continued, his gaze settling on Colonel Webb with an intensity that suggested deeper currents running beneath his words. "The adoption ceremony requires witnesses from both cultures, people who can testify that the process was conducted according to proper traditions. The ranch community would need to participate in the ceremony, which would make you all accomplices in what Morrison will certainly claim is an elaborate fraud designed to evade legal debt collection." Webb was quiet for a long moment, considering implications that went far beyond Eleanor's immediate situation. He was being asked to risk everything he had built, not just for one woman and child, but for a principle that transcended legal technicalities. "How many people would need to be involved?" he asked. "Everyone," Silent Hawk said simply. "Comanche." Adoption ceremonies are community events that require the participation of the entire tribal group. If we're going to make this work, it has to be done properly, with full ritual authority and community witness. Eleanor looked around the room, at faces that had become as dear to her as family, and she saw the same calculation being made behind every pair of eyes. They were being asked to risk their freedom, their security, and their futures for the sake of someone who had arrived as a stranger only months ago. The magnitude of what Silent Hawk was proposing should have made it impossible, but Eleanor could see something else in those faces, a recognition that some bonds transcended blood and law and created obligations that no written statute could dissolve. "When would this ceremony need to take place?" Webb asked, and Eleanor felt her heart leap as she realized that he was not asking whether they would do it, but how it could be accomplished. "The new moon is in 10 days, Silent Hawk replied. Comanche tradition requires adoption ceremonies to take place during the dark of the moon, when the spirits of the ancestors can move freely between worlds. We would need to leave for the reservation in 8 days to allow time for proper preparation. Eleanor felt the reality of what was being proposed settling into her bones like winter cold. In 8 days, she would have to leave the only home she had known since James died, abandon the identity she had carried for 26 years, and trust her future to a culture that most white Americans considered savage and dangerous. But she would also be placing Stella under the protection of people who valued courage and loyalty above legal documents, who measured worth by character rather than blood, and who had produced a man like Silent Hawk. What about the ranch? Sarah Whitmore asked, voicing the concern that Eleanor knew was weighing on everyone's mind. If we all participate in this ceremony, and Morrison files federal charges against us, what happens to Broken Arrow? Webb was quiet for a moment, then smiled with an expression that reminded Eleanor why his men had followed him through the hell of civil war. Sarah, I've been thinking about that question since the day Blackwood first rode onto this property. This ranch was built as a refuge for people who didn't fit anywhere else, a place where different kinds of folks could work together and build something better than what they'd left behind. If we abandon that principle now because we're afraid of federal prosecutors, then we've already lost everything that made this place worth building. Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to Webb commit himself and his community to a course of action that could destroy everything they had worked to create. The courage required to make such a choice was beyond anything she had imagined possible, and she found herself wondering what she had done to deserve such fierce loyalty from people who owed her nothing. There's something else you need to understand, Silent Hawk said, his voice taking on the formal cadence he used when imparting important wisdom. Comanche adoption is not a temporary arrangement or a legal fiction. If you accept adoption into the tribe, Eleanor Brooks will cease to exist in any meaningful sense. You will become Comanche in law, tradition, and spirit. Your obligations will be to the people, not to the memories of your former life. Are you prepared for that level of transformation? Eleanor closed her eyes and thought about the woman she had been when she first walked into Iron Ridge, desperate and broken, and clinging to an identity that had been defined entirely by her relationship to a dead man. Then she thought about the woman she had become at Broken Arrow Ranch, someone who could feed an army, manage complex operations, and stand up to armed men when her daughter's safety was at stake. The transformation Silent Hawk was describing had already begun. He was simply offering to make it complete and permanent. I understand, Eleanor said, opening her eyes and looking directly at Silent Hawk with a certainty that surprised her. Eleanor Brooks was already dead. She died when James did, and I've been trying to become someone new ever since. If the Comanche people will have us, then Stella and I will be honored to join them. Silent Hawk nodded with satisfaction, then turned to address the assembled ranch community. Then we have 8 days to prepare for a ceremony that will change all our lives. The next time federal marshals come looking for Eleanor Brooks, they'll find only Comanche citizens under tribal protection and witnesses who will swear that Eleanor Brooks disappeared into the desert and was never seen again. As the community began making plans for the most audacious rescue operation any of them had ever attempted, Eleanor felt a sense of peace settling over her that had nothing to do with legal protection or federal authority. She was about to join a people who measured worth by courage rather than social standing, who valued loyalty above law, and who had produced warriors like Silent Hawk. Whatever name she carried and whatever identity she claimed, she would still be surrounded by people who had chosen to risk everything for her sake. The next 8 days passed in a blur of preparation and ceremony as the ranch community prepared to witness the transformation of Eleanor and Stella Brooks into Comanche citizens. Silent Hawk worked with traditional crafters to create the clothing and ornaments required for the adoption ceremony, while Eleanor spent her final days as a white woman, learning the songs and rituals that would mark her passage into a new life. On the morning they were scheduled to depart for the reservation, Eleanor stood in the kitchen where she had spent so many happy hours and tried to memorize every detail of the place that had given her back her life. Tomorrow night, Eleanor Brooks would die in a ceremony older than territorial law, and someone new would be born to take her place. As Silent Hawk helped her and Stella mount their horses for the journey north, Eleanor looked back at Broken Arrow Ranch one final time and whispered a promise to the wind. Whatever name she carried and whatever people claimed her, she would never forget the community that had chosen love over law and had given her the courage to become who she was always meant to be.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.